The housekeeper's arrival at a divorced businessman's business dinner stunned everyone. Despite her commitment to her work and nearly 3 years of employment at Richard Blake's mansion, Evelyn never anticipated that he would summon her for such an unusual and unexpected conversation. Richard, a well-known and aloof businessman, was going through a crisis in his company and needed to impress influential investors at a business dinner that evening. Not having the time or patience to find a suitable companion, he looked at Evelyn, who was cleaning the shelves in his office, and said arrogantly, "I need you to go to an important dinner tonight. This is not an invitation, it's an instruction, so go and behave. I need someone discreet and without an opinion of their own." Despite her surprise, Evelyn remained silent. The request felt more like an order, but she knew it was her opportunity to prove something more, so she accepted it. Evelyn showed up at the restaurant on schedule, dressed elegantly. Richard was clearly impatient, waiting at the entrance as if she were taking a useless item rather than entering the elegant restaurant. He hardly gave her a glance. Evelyn sensed that everyone was looking at them. The investors were waiting at a table in the middle of the room when Richard introduced Evelyn in a vague and uninteresting manner, without even mentioning her last name. "This is Evelyn. She's going with me tonight," he said quickly, averting his eyes. The investors' men in suits, who were evaluating Evelyn, responded with courteous smiles, though some of them exchanged confused looks with each other. It was clear from their silent looks of judgment that Evelyn did not belong there. Despite taking in every detail, Evelyn remained composed as Richard and the investors talked about financial figures, profitability, and expansion strategies during the dinner. Evelyn remained silent, attentively observing and absorbing every detail. At one point, one of the investors, Mr. Lewis, a large man with an intimidating posture, turned to her and grinned patronizingly, which made Evelyn feel uncomfortable. In a tone that obviously anticipated a reserved answer, he inquired, "How do you feel about attending a business dinner like this?" Evelyn could have smiled and said something trivial to ease the tension at the table, but she spoke up. "It's fascinating to see how everything works up close," she said calmly, acknowledging the worry about financial details and projections. "I think understanding the people behind the numbers is also essential." The looks around the table froze. While Richard observed her with a mixture of surprise and annoyance, Evelyn remained composed. She had just demonstrated that she had a voice of her own, something he had told her to refrain from doing. While the other investors gazed at her with renewed attention, Mr. Lewis, who was taken aback by her statement, responded with a brief laugh, but appeared captivated by an intriguing viewpoint. As the dinner went on, Richard's expression hardened, and he became clearly uncomfortable with the attention Evelyn was beginning to receive. The night was turning into anything but discreet, which was exactly what he had planned, but Evelyn appeared to be finally finding her own voice in a setting that didn't seem to belong to her up until that point. Even though Evelyn could tell Richard was uncomfortable, he avoided making eye contact with her. Mr. Lewis was clearly irritated by her demeanor during the dinner, but he appeared more eager to include Evelyn in the conversation, possibly because she was the only person there defying expectations. The stereotype he anticipated at a business dinner, which seemed to further alienate Richard from the investors' interests when the conversation turned to social responsibility, Evelyn took advantage of the chance to inquire, "Does Mr. Blake already consider social projects in his company?" Mr. Lewis glared at Richard, who hesitated before he could respond incoherently. Without losing her cool, Evelyn gave a direct response. "Since all businesses exist for reasons other than merely making money, I think social projects are a means to give back to the community for the success the firm has achieved. Making a profit would be a crucial step." Evelyn sensed that everyone was watching her as the table fell silent, but she chose to remain composed since she believed that this was an issue of integrity. Richard's expression went rigid when Mr. Lewis, who was clearly impressed, smiled and said, "I think, Evelyn, it's rare to hear that around here." He had brought Evelyn to the dinner to be invisible, and now that she was drawing unwanted attention and making him angry, he decided to do something that would change the course of the evening. Indeed, it's effortless to converse when one is unaware of the significance of leadership choices. "Don't you think you're speaking about something you don't understand?" he asked, slightly smirking at Evelyn. As their gazes locked, Evelyn sensed the challenge in Richard's remarks, but instead of backing down, she responded with force. "Although I may not be aware of the weight of leadership decisions, I am aware of their impact, and occasionally people lower in the hierarchy can see things that others higher up cannot." Her reaction was surprising and straightforward. The other investors exchanged affirming glances as Mr. Lewis, apparently thrilled by Evelyn's encouragement, burst out laughing. Everyone was impressed by Evelyn's manner, and within minutes she had altered the dynamics of the dinner. Richard fell silent, feeling that he had lost control of the situation. He attempted to hide his discomfort, but the damage had already been done to him. This was an unforgivable affront. When the dinner came to an end, he didn't wait for Evelyn to leave with him. Instead, he left her behind. Although Evelyn didn't require his presence, she was confident in her ability to assert herself and make her voice heard, and that was the most important thing to her. Little did she know that Richard wouldn't let that night pass without taking care of her back at the mansion. Richard was unable to control his annoyance. Without any formalities, he pulled Evelyn into his office as soon as she entered. His eyes were filled with annoyance and contempt. "What were you thinking?" He shot at Evelyn just as he was about to sit down. "Please go with me so we can be discreet and not draw attention." Evelyn was calm after the stressful night and didn't regret what she did. "I just answered a question, Mr. Richard. I did nothing but voice my opinion," which she did in a controlled tone. He looked at her with contempt. "Evelyn, as a housekeeper, you don't receive compensation for voicing your opinions during a business dinner. You went too far, Evelyn. A business dinner does not compensate you for your opinion. You receive no compensation for your opinions. You receive no compensation for your opinions. A business dinner does not compensate you for your opinion. You crossed all boundaries." Richard didn't understand why she wanted to show him she was more than just a cleaner. "If I was annoying, why did you take me there?" Evelyn spoke in a calm yet assertive tone. "Don't convince me that you were performing your duties and receiving compensation, even if it meant remaining silent." Richard answered in a cool, collected tone, "This is your last day here. You're fired." The declaration seemed like a last sentence, but Evelyn refused to let the impact show. Instead, she simply nodded and turned back, leaving the mansion knowing that this harsh dismissal was only the beginning of a new chapter. The following day, as she was packing her last belongings, she received an unexpected call from Mr. Lewis, the investor, who had been impressed by her behavior at the dinner and wanted her on his team, a position she had never imagined being offered to her. With a mixture of surprise and resolve, Evelyn accepted the offer, and the humiliation of Richard's firing swiftly turned into the chance of a lifetime in the months that followed. Evelyn demonstrated in her new role under Mr. Lewis's direction that she had never had the opportunity to explore her talents and abilities while working for Richard. Her co-workers soon noticed her leadership abilities and tenacity, and she eventually found herself in a setting that respected and heard her opinions. Let's engage in a game with those who have only read the comments. Let's continue the story, since only those who have read this far understand the pizza in the comments. Richard's circumstances, however, couldn't have been more dire. Richard's company's situation deteriorated due to his hasty decisions made solely for short-term financial gain, and his arrogance led to the loss of important contracts and the alienation of crucial business partners. When the company where Evelyn now works purchased a sizable portion of Richard's company's shares, Evelyn was placed in a leadership role directly related to his business. The reunion took place at a major leaders' meeting. When Richard walked in and saw Evelyn seated at the conference table, his face went pale, and he hesitated, staring at her as though he was trying to figure out how his former housekeeper could be present among the leaders. Evelyn looked back at him. She was persistent but calm, showing no signs of animosity. What was important to her was her new role and the chance to change things. After the meeting, Richard approached her, his expression tight and filled with a mixture of incredulity and irritation as the tension began to build. In an attempt to maintain control, he whispered to Evelyn, "You're here with them now." "Yes, I am, and as you can see, our company has acquired a significant stake in your business." Richard scoffed, hiding his uncertainty. "This is absurd. Do you really believe that simply because you work here, you know what true leadership is?" Evelyn remained steadfast, refusing to let his astonishment change her attitude. Evelyn stayed composed. He moved his face inches from hers, but she didn't back down. "Don't think this changes anything between us. You are still a lucky housekeeper. Richard, I learned exactly what not to do when I worked for you as a team leader, and how to ignore the arrogance that blinds people. It was quite a lesson. The difference between us is that Evelyn crossed her arms and gazed back at her forceful voice. "Richard, I don't require your respect. You, on the other hand, are falling because you have never valued anything but yourself. But I earned my position, and it wasn't luck." Richard stopped talking without having a prepared answer. To maintain his composure, he said, "The company you're trying to take over is mine. Then prove it." The confrontation revealed the flaws he had spent his life trying to ignore, and for the first time he felt a genuine doubt, and it came from someone he had thought insignificant. "I'll prove to you that I don't need anyone," he said. Evelyn's voice. Despite being calm, Evelyn's challenging stare demonstrates that you can still govern and save your own empire. However, keep in mind that people who believe they know everything eventually fail. Usually, everything is quicker. She silently left him there, taking in each word as if it were a harsh reality. Despite feeling alone and ashamed, the chat helped Richard realize for the first time that he was heading towards further destruction. Evelyn was no longer just his adversary. She was the mirror he dreaded the most, exposing his shortcomings without granting him mercy. Richard found it harder to forget the mistakes that had brought him close to bankruptcy the first time after the encounter. Evelyn's comments resonated in his mind like a truth he wished he had never heard. Richard contemplated his hasty decisions instead of immersing himself in plans to salvage what remained that night. A few days later, the investors summoned Richard and Evelyn to a pivotal meeting. The tense atmosphere suggested that the future of his company hinged on this meeting. Richard felt the weight of his pride, the same arrogance that had driven away beneficial employees, partners, and even his own family. Richard, who was exhausted and anxious, walked into the room stiffly, attempting to project confidence. The investor leader spoke candidly, saying, "The current state of your company is alarming, Richard. We need a drastic change, and quickly, to be clear. This is your last chance to convince the board that you are capable of leading and reversing this situation." Evelyn was already there, calmly going over some documents. In an attempt to retake control, Richard started discussing new plans and strategies while struggling to keep his posture straight. However, it was clear that his vision was still merely surface level and concentrated on short-term financial gain. After noticing that Richard was making the same mistakes, the investors exchanged doubtful glances before Evelyn spoke up and shocked everyone with her strategy. "This company's focus needs to shift. It is no longer sufficient to only pursue profit. We also need to re-establish the brand's connection with the public, which entails a sincere commitment to social responsibility and our employees. The group leader gave Evelyn the all-clear as the investors exchanged curious looks, and she spoke boldly about the advantages of incorporating social projects and humanizing the business, making a positive influence and guaranteeing a viable future alongside her. When the meeting ended, the investors appeared more confident with the plans Evelyn presented. As they left the room, Richard stopped in the hallway, and Evelyn noticed him. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. "Why would you help me save this company?" The investor's admiration for Evelyn was evident in every word, and he was losing control of everything while she saved his company. Richard felt helpless. Evelyn took a deep breath before responding without hesitation. "Unlike you, she values people, and more importantly, she believes that our company will thrive in the future, whether or not you are present." For the first time, those words struck Richard hard, and he stood silently, taking them in. He had a sincere desire to improve himself, going beyond pride and independence. After observing him for a while, Evelyn turned and left. Richard became aware that this woman, who had previously been invisible to him, was now his most significant role model. Even though he tried to make amends, Richard felt that Evelyn was always criticizing him, even though he knew he had made a lot of mistakes. The tension between them became intolerable because Richard felt Evelyn had come to represent all he had failed to be. He wanted to change, but he also wanted to show that he still had something to offer. He scheduled a crucial meeting with the board of investors that week. Despite the precarious financial situation, Richard was determined to demonstrate his leadership and potentially earn Evelyn's trust. On the day of the meeting, Evelyn arrived early and prepared the entire presentation. Evelyn's impeccable demeanor and sharp words seemed to see through all his intentions before he even spoke, which greatly irritated him. However, when the meeting began, Evelyn presented her strategy to stabilize growth without compromising resources. Richard had prepared a parallel speech that he intended to introduce during the meeting to add a bold touch to the plans. He thought this move would be sufficient to impress the board and show his commitment. Although Richard was aware that the board members were predisposed to back her, he persisted in his goal. "I comprehend Evelyn's plan." At a pivotal moment in the presentation, Richard interrupted her, saying, "I think expansion needs to be done more boldly. We need to show the market that we are in a new phase." Evelyn gave him a disbelieving and disapproving look. She knew Richard was attempting to prove something, but she didn't want to let her ego rule her tone at this point. "Richard, you are aware that this strategy has already caused us significant issues. Therefore, we are now focusing on reorganizing the business and prioritizing our objective over rapid expansion." The board listened to their exchange, which was evidently divided, but Richard refused to compromise, leading Evelyn to proceed. "I understand your concern, but if we don't take risks, we're destined to settle for mediocrity, which will eventually lead to failure. The business needs visibility and outcomes." Evelyn shook her head, staying composed. "The business needs consistency." The tension in the room was evident, Richard. "The people we are assisting require a sustainable initiative. We have transcended the stage where we function like a business motivated by the egos of its leaders." A few board members gave Evelyn a positive glance. Others appeared open to hearing Richard's point of view, but Mr. Haynes, the board president, stepped in and asked both parties to submit a combined proposal at the following meeting. Evelyn nodded while keeping a composed demeanor, but Richard felt like he had lost the fight when he realized he no longer controlled the business he had founded. His sense of powerlessness increased that night, and he remained in the office looking over financial reports in an attempt to find a way to make his proposal more enticing. His mind was racing with ideas, but none of them seemed really feasible without jeopardizing the stability of the project. At that moment, a message from an old acquaintance showed up on his phone. It was a businessman who was willing to own a sizable portion of the company in exchange for a minor voice in the social project's decisions. For Richard, this seemed like a practical way to get the money he sorely needed, while also demonstrating to Evelyn that he could act in the company's best interests without consulting the board or Evelyn. He set up a meeting with the investor the following day, shared his vision for quick expansion, and within hours signed an initial contract. When Evelyn heard about the contract, she immediately went to Richard's office because he was on a video call with the new investor discussing expansion plans. However, as soon as he saw Evelyn enter, a chill went down his spine because she was furious, and he knew he wouldn't escape unscathed. When the call ended, Evelyn crossed her arms and looked at him with such intensity that it made him shudder. Richard felt victorious because he finally had something tangible to show off his leadership abilities. How could you accomplish that? Richard inhaled deeply, bracing himself for the impending argument. Evelyn shook her head in shock, saying, "Save the company, Richard. Don't you realize how risky this is?" "We need this money to expand," she said. "I'm trying to save the company just like you. Investors can now influence the choices we make for our social projects. What occurs when somebody becomes interested in molding things to suit his own needs?" Richard made an effort to keep everything under control. Evelyn narrowed her eyes and asked, "What happened to the commitment?" "It's a calculated gamble and he has no control. All he wants is a little portion." Those statements hit him like a blow to the gut. He felt vulnerable and exposed, but he also despised Evelyn's relentless criticism. "Why are you always expecting me to fail? Value people to act transparently. This isn't the kind of leadership we promised to develop." "Evelyn, I want to act morally, so let's play a light-hearted joke on those who have only read the comments. Let's continue the story, because only those who've read this far will understand the chocolate in the comments." Evelyn inhaled deeply, her tone remaining stern, but her eyes melting slightly. "It's not my intention for you to fail. Richard, you need to realize the consequences of your conduct. Being a leader involves more than just making important choices. It's about accountability, and behaving covertly simply serves to demonstrate that you still lack that understanding." Feeling the weight of her words, Richard averted his gaze. "Perhaps I won't ever comprehend it the way you desire, Evelyn." She nodded, anticipating that answer. "But until you do, you'll keep breaking your commitments, and that can be too much." The members were worried about the implications of the contract, and the tension in the room was apparent when the meeting began. Evelyn was the first to voice her concern that this contract represents a shift in the principles we established, now that an outside investor is interfering with our social projects. 2 weeks later, the board met again to discuss the deal Richard had made without approval. "I think everyone here is aware of the dangers this poses." Following Evelyn's protests, Mr. Haynes asked Richard to defend his choice. Richard forced himself to swallow in order to keep his cool. The board president interrupted him, saying, "I think the investment will give us the financial strength needed to expand and make the project sustainable in the long term. Gay Richard, you acted hastily, and this isn't solely a financial matter. We're addressing a social goal that necessitates compromise." Richard sensed the pressure building as he turned to face Evelyn, who had a disapproving expression on her face. He realized that he had lost more than just the board's trust. He had also lost the final opportunity to demonstrate his capacity for change. At the conclusion of the meeting, the board agreed to review Richard's role and consider giving him less control over choices going forward. Feeling defeated, Richard quietly left the room after realizing that he had to let go of his ego if he truly wanted to change. After the disastrous meeting with the board, Richard was on the verge of an emotional breakdown. The feeling of defeat followed him home, a home that once symbolized his success, but now felt empty and cold. He had spent years building a solid career and a powerful reputation, and suddenly everything he had accomplished seemed to be falling apart. He realized his own actions were to blame, not the board or Evelyn. Evelyn wasn't just trying to correct his actions, she was also trying to teach him a new way to lead. Everything he had attempted to establish with Evelyn was disintegrating due to his impetuous choices and obstinacy. Richard couldn't deny the fact that he continued to behave with the same immediacy and selfishness that had always guided him, leading to a growing distance from his own staff, the board, and most importantly, Evelyn. The following morning, Richard decided to arrive at work early. He felt a heavy sense of regret and emptiness, but he needed to know what had truly motivated him to act in that manner. He knew there was no point in confronting Evelyn or the board again. He needed answers for himself. Sitting in his office, surrounded by reports and notes, Richard found himself reflecting on his own choices, something he had never done so thoroughly before. He thought back to Evelyn's remarks during the meeting, in which she questioned his vision as a leader and as a person. Now that he was starting to grasp the significance of those words, he wondered what leadership actually meant and whether he had ever understood its essence. He may have never had true leadership that morning as he gazed at the empty office. Perhaps he had only been acting as a cold, calculating businessman who thought success depended only on numbers. However, now that he was losing his job and the confidence of everyone around him, he realized that his leadership needed to be more than just numbers. When Evelyn showed up at the office door in the late afternoon, Richard realized he needed to examine the people there who had evolved into more than just resources on a spreadsheet. Her expression was serious, but she wasn't cold. Perhaps she was seeing his vulnerability for the first time. Weary of the arguments and confrontations, Richard chose to be honest with Evelyn, but he started off hesitantly. Evelyn regarded him silently with her arms crossed, but something in her posture suggested that she was willing to listen to him. "I know I've made a lot of mistakes, and that my choices have had a greater impact on others than I can undo. It is a beginning." Although she spoke more softly, "Richard, acknowledging your errors is insufficient. What are your plans to address them?" Feeling the weight of that question, Richard inhaled deeply. He had considered it, but he still lacked clear answers. "Evelyn is unknown to me. I simply know that I can't continue in the same manner." Evelyn nodded slowly, acknowledging that meaningful transformation requires daily effort. "You must learn to listen and realize that serving others comes before maintaining control. Are you still willing to do that?" Richard took a deep breath. "Yes, I'm willing, but I'm not sure whether I can handle it by myself." Evelyn gave a half. "No one can, Richard," so she smiled as though she saw a glimmer of hope. "This is why genuine leadership necessitates partnerships. You must have faith in others and recognize that you cannot achieve everything on your own." After a long silence, Evelyn said, "If you really want to change, there's a way, but it's going to be hard, and it will require you to leave behind everything you believe you know about leadership." Her words resonated in his mind, as he had always tried to control everything alone, believing that trusting others would weaken his leadership abilities. However, as he confronted his own limitations, he began to recognize that trust might be the missing element in his leadership style. In the same week that Evelyn took Richard to the hospital, Richard looked up with a renewed sense of hope and said, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Show me how I can help. He initiated his first charitable endeavor as a component of the business's recovery efforts. The primary objective of the project was to empower women in vulnerable situations to enter the workforce. In one of the sessions with the female participants, Richard, who is accustomed to the opulence and formality of business, felt uncomfortably real in the community setting. As he heard their stories, Richard started to feel the impact of each one. This wasn't about statistics or profits, but rather about people whose lives depended on every penny and every opportunity. Richard found himself sitting among people he never would have thought he'd meet: single mothers, women surviving abusive relationships, and others fighting to support their families. An elderly woman with deep eyes and grey hair approached him at the conclusion of the conference. "You're Mr. Richard Blake, correct?" she questioned firmly, referring to the owner of the business now funding this initiative. Richard nodded in embarrassment. "Yes, that's me." The woman stared at him for a while before saying, "My son worked for you a few years ago. Your company let him go without explanation after years of dedication. It devastated him. You know he lost his motivation." I apologize for not realizing that she was shaking her head slowly. "Perhaps you didn't care, but I saw you here today, and I think maybe things are changing. I just hope this transformation is genuine." Richard felt a constriction in his chest. Richard felt vulnerable as the woman's words resonated with an undeniable truth. For years he had been the businessman causing so much anguish without even realizing it. Evelyn described a person who remained unsettled by the experience and failed to recognize the significance of the people within the business. Richard sincerely thanked Evelyn for taking him to the project today, saying, "I truly understood what you meant, Evelyn." Evelyn gave him a glance, and this time her eyes were not icy. They just understood that this was only the beginning. "Change requires time and effort, Richard. But perhaps you'll eventually realize that serving that same week is equivalent to leading." Entering the room, Richard felt the team's eyes on him. Some were suspicious, others were expecting, and he knew he had a lot to prove and little time to win back their trust. Evelyn encouraged him to go to a meeting with the social project team because it would be a crucial opportunity for him to hear the staff's concerns and suggestions, something he had always overlooked. Evelyn urged him to speak, but he was hesitant, thinking that perhaps it would be better to listen first. The meeting started with each team member testifying and offering their opinions and worries about the project's advancement. Mark, a young, optimistic and committed individual, discussed the difficulties the project was having because of a lack of funding and the necessity for consistency in order to meet deadlines. Richard told Mark in a forceful but kind manner that we must view the social endeavor as a temporary investment because these individuals depend on us, which calls for patience and dedication. Richard carefully listened to everything said, taking in the consequences of his earlier choices. After the meeting, Richard made the decision for Ed to become actively involved in the project, not as a leader, but as a student, because he wanted to observe firsthand how the decisions he made in the office affected people at the most fundamental level. He realized that Mark, like Evelyn, wanted the project to succeed, but with a clear and lasting purpose. For the first time, he found himself wanting to understand others' perspectives instead of imposing his own. Evelyn went with him on a few of his visits to the communities the project served. On one of those visits, Richard met Julia, a young mother who had discovered an opportunity to better her life through the training program. She spoke passionately about how the project had helped her secure employment so she could provide for her young daughter. As he heard her narrative, Richard felt a knot in his throat, since it served as a reminder that he was interacting with actual people who had goals, hardships, and stories. This was more than just a spreadsheet project. He witnessed the impact of the work Evelyn so fervently promoted and realized that the most significant outcomes lay not in the statistics, but rather in the personal growth of each individual the initiative affected. Richard discovered Evelyn back at the office and stated, "You were right," in a more solemn, determined tone. "Evelyn, I always saw this as a tool for growth, something to boost my reputation and propel me back to the top. But now I realize that my perspective was wholly incorrect." Evelyn watched as he thought carefully about what he was going to say. "What do you plan to do?" he asked, taking a deep breath. "I want to learn. I want to approach this in a way that serves and demonstrates the true impact of what we're building. I want every individual involved in these projects to discover something new." Evelyn nodded when she first saw Richard's sincerity, and he then demonstrated to us that you can change not just with words, but also with deeds. Over the next few weeks, Richard kept working on the projects, closely monitoring each initiative's progress and learning from the team. His role gradually changed from being the boss giving orders to someone who was willing to listen, understand, and serve the board, though he was still skeptical. She also noticed small changes in Richard's behavior, such as his increased openness to criticism and decreased tendency to make snap decisions. By the end of that month, Richard felt more at peace with himself and his actions for the first time, seeing the project not as a chance for personal success, but as a mission that involved and benefited many lives. When Evelyn passed by his office, he stood up and thanked her, saying, "Thank you, Evelyn, for not giving up even when it seemed I'd never understand." She smiled slightly, but she was cautious because she knew that true change was a gradual and ongoing process. "Richard, leadership is a long journey, but if you put your heart into it, I'm confident you'll see its true worth from this fresh angle." In the weeks after the crisis, Richard felt prepared for a journey of authentic and transformative leadership. He committed to learning every aspect of the work, from weekly community visits to thorough financial reports. Rather than viewing the project as a simple investment, he now saw it as a mission, one that offered him the chance to restore not only the team's and the board's trust, but also his own self-image. The board members became aware of this shift. Evelyn was one of the first to see how involved Richard had become in the initial months. She observed him from a distance, curious to see if this new attitude would last. However, over time, Richard's constant presence at the project, his sincere questions, and his effort to listen and understand showed that he was genuinely committed, as his determination became evident, and the board's respect and trust in him also grew. At first, Richard attended the project meetings as a formality, but soon these visits became an essential part of his routine. He started learning the participants' names, understanding their stories, and tracking their progress. It was a reality very different from the luxurious office and meetings with influential businessmen that previously filled his time. On one of these visits, he had a long conversation with Anna, a middle-aged woman who had lost her job and found a new chance to start over in the project. Anna told him with a sincerity that moved him about the difficulties she had faced and how the initiative helped her regain her dignity. "It's more than a job for me," Mr. Richard, Anna said with emotion in her eyes. Richard felt a knot in his throat because he wasn't just helping one person, he was transforming entire lives, and every tale he heard served as a reminder of the impact he had. "It's a new life, and for the first time I feel like someone knows my potential, could have, and this insight strengthened his resolve even more." He wanted to earn the confidence these individuals had in the project, and more importantly, he wanted to demonstrate that he genuinely cared. The project was no longer merely a paper plan. It had come to life, the results started to appear, and the company's reputation increased along with them. Board members who had previously questioned Richard's capacity to lead responsibly now showed signs of approval in board meetings. Richard presented the project results with humility, highlighting Evelyn's crucial role and the team's hard work. He avoided the grandiose manner that had once defined him, and stayed composed and straightforward. Every piece of data was concrete evidence that the project was having an impact, and the board members were not hiding their satisfaction. During one of those meetings, Mr. Haynes, the board chairman, made a statement. "Richard, it appears that you are taking this initiative seriously, which surprised many of us. If this pilot project proves successful, I'm confident we can grow it in a sustainable way." Richard grinned subtly, feeling the weight of the praise. He knew Evelyn had been a crucial mentor during this process, and he made sure to thank her at every meeting, but as they spent more time together, what had initially been merely professional admiration started to develop into something more. During one of their community visits, Richard began to see Evelyn differently. He saw that she was more than just a brilliant leader. She was a strong, honest woman who was passionate about her work. He saw this in the way she spoke to each project participant, the attention to detail, and the respect she showed everyone. Evelyn was a quiet force that inspired trust and respect. Richard and Evelyn attended a project beneficiary-hosted event. The attendees had planned a small celebration to express gratitude to the team for their assistance. When they arrived, Richard observed Evelyn interacting with people in a way that touched him deeply. She seemed to fit in, and everyone responded to her warmth and presence. She truly understood these people. As they strolled through the peaceful streets of the neighborhood, Richard felt compelled to learn more about Evelyn because she was an enigmatic figure, and he wanted to know what drove her to be so passionately involved in their work. "I've always been impressed by your dedication to this project. What led you to get so deeply involved?" he said softly, thinking admiringly that Evelyn wasn't just the leader of the project, but also a part of it. When the celebration came to an end, Richard offered to walk Evelyn back to the office. "Richard, I guess I've always felt the need to do something. Beyond myself, when I was younger, I saw people close to me facing hardships, and it left a mark. Working on something that can help others start over is, for me, the best way to give meaning to my own life." Those words touched Richard in an unexpected way. He had never allowed himself to see the work from that perspective. For him, it was a way to build reputation and legacy. But for Evelyn, it was a personal mission, and from that moment he began to understand what really drove the extraordinary woman beside him. In the following weeks, Richard and Evelyn started working even closer. The partnership that had once been formal and cautious now became more relaxed and filled with mutual admiration. They discussed strategies, shared ideas, and supported each other in every decision. However, Richard realized that something had changed in his heart. He didn't just admire Evelyn, he was beginning to fall in love with her. This feeling caught him by surprise. One night after a lengthy meeting, they stayed in the office and talked about the future of the project. The conversation started professionally, but quickly became more personal. Richard, who had always been wary and even skeptical about personal relationships at work, found himself thinking about Evelyn frequently and searching for ways to be by her side and see her smile. She was a steady yet welcoming presence who challenged him to be better. "Evelyn, I genuinely owe you everything I've learned in the last few months," he added. "I thought success was about dominating and growing, but you showed me that it's about creating something meaningful. I'm delighted to hear that this meant anything to you, Richard. Your transformation is one of the most rewarding things I've ever seen." Evelyn glanced at him, taken aback by the depth of his comments. For a brief while, there seemed to be a comfortable and subtle tension in the air as their eyes locked. As the days passed, Richard noticed the small details about Evelyn, such as the way she smiled when discussing something that moved her, how she inspired everyone around her, and the conviction with which she defended the project's purpose. He realized that Evelyn was special, someone who brought a depth and meaning to his life that he had never experienced before. But he was hesitant to move closer because he didn't want to cross boundaries that could jeopardize their professional relationship. "Richard, you know you're one of the most incredible individuals I've ever known, so I didn't even consider leaving a comment." Evelyn laughed softly, surprised by the sincerity of his words. "Thank you, Richard, but I think you've also changed a lot and become someone admirable." Her words resonated in his heart, and he realized he was truly in love. But this time it wasn't just an impulse or a fleeting attraction. It was a deep admiration, a desire to share the same mission with Evelyn and to build something meaningful together. That night, as he walked home, Richard understood that the transformation Evelyn had brought about in him was not just professional. She had changed his heart, and he knew that regardless of what the future held, his life would never be the same. The days continued to pass, and Richard and Evelyn grew closer. Their professional partnership evolved into something more intimate, a closeness that deepened with every interaction. Once driven by ego and power, Richard now found himself sharing moments of vulnerability and authenticity with Evelyn, feeling lighter, more alive, and most importantly, more complete. As Evelyn spent more time with Richard, she noticed that he had transformed and was evolving into a genuinely admirable man. His transformation was genuine, drawing her in a surprising way. In the ensuing weeks, Richard found small ways to get closer to Evelyn, including inviting her to lunch after meetings, suggesting walks together at the end of a long day, and always finding time to talk about things. Evelyn was impressed by his resolve to turn his life around and create something that truly mattered, and gradually her heart opened to him. After another demanding day on the project, Richard and Evelyn stayed in the office to review one last report. The dim light and the silence of the night created an intimate and welcoming atmosphere. They were sitting side by side, their arms nearly touching, and Richard couldn't help but feel a wave of desire and tenderness as he looked at her. "I wanted to thank you for everything, for teaching me, for believing in me even when I didn't deserve it," he said abruptly, breaking the silence. Evelyn looked at him, surprised by the depth of his voice, and he said, "You don't need to thank me. Richard, it was you who brought about the shift." I merely conveyed his smile, but he had more to express. His heart had been pounding for days, and he realized it was time to be open about how he felt. He said, "I can't hide what I feel anymore. The truth is, I'm in love with you." And Evelyn remained silent, her eyes riveted on his. He started out hesitantly but determinedly. Fearing that he had erred by sharing his emotions, Richard's heart raced. However, instead of retreating, Evelyn smiled gently, her eyes glistening. "I've been feeling this way for a while, but I worried it would affect everything we've created. Richard, I'm in love with you too." She admitted it with such passion that it made his heart accelerate. "I felt the same fear that Richard expressed, but I can't pretend that these feelings don't still exist. I want to be with you genuinely, not only as co-workers, but as something more." Richard laughed a relieved and emotional chuckle. Evelyn nodded and continued to smile, saying, "I want that too. I think we're finally ready for something more." They sat side by side, drawing closer, and Richard felt his heart race as Evelyn's lips met his in a tender, passionate kiss. It was a moment of pure connection where all barriers fell and only the feeling remained. After that day, their relationship naturally blossomed, and they started going out together outside of work, exploring the city, sharing dinners, and going on outings. They got to know each other better every moment, and the more they learned about each other, the more they realized how well they worked together. Their dynamic remained focused and professional, but the team noticed the sparkle in both of their eyes and the bond that seemed to deepen. Despite their relationship, Evelyn and Richard made it clear that their commitment to the project would always come first. However, it was clear that their love for one another also motivated them to work hard, and as the months went by, the initiative achieved unprecedented success. The project's gradual expansion into other regions was underway. The company gained recognition for its positive and sustainable impact. The local community flourished, and participants found employment opportunities and personal growth that had previously seemed impossible. The board was pleased and ultimately granted Richard full approval to return to his leadership roles. You showed us that adapting and learning can make the project successful, and your dedication and vision are to thank. I am glad to report that you are now a true leader. Mr. Haynes, who is normally a harsh critic, made it a point to thank him in a meeting. Knowing that the road to this point had been long and difficult, Richard thanked him humbly. As he looked at Evelyn sitting next to him, he felt a wave of gratitude for everything she had done for him. Without her, he knew he would not have made it this far outside of work. Richard and Evelyn's relationship grew. They were content together, and their love was sincere and profound. On a sunny afternoon, as they strolled through a park, Richard had the feeling that Evelyn felt the same way. "I never thought I would find someone like, you," Richard murmured, holding Evelyn's hand and averting his eyes from hers. His voice was full of emotion. "You've changed my life, Evelyn, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy." They were starting a new journey that would be difficult but rewarding, but this time they knew they would face everything together. The project continued to grow, and the company became an example of social responsibility and ethical leadership. Evelyn smiled, her eyes welling with tears of joy, and she said, "I want that too, Richard. You're not the same man I met at first. You're so much better, and I love you for who you've become." In order to guarantee that the beneficial effects kept spreading to new communities, Richard and Evelyn assumed co-leadership roles. They became well known as successful leaders, as well as an inspirational couple who demonstrated how love, ethics, and commitment can change lives and create something genuinely meaningful. Richard and Evelyn's business won multiple awards and received media attention for its social impact. But their true legacy lay in the lives they transformed. While financial success was significant, it was nothing compared to the happiness of seeing families. Months later, Richard and Evelyn married in a small private ceremony, surrounded by friends, co-workers, and community members they had helped transform. They exchanged vows of love and commitment, which went beyond simple romantic vows to include promises to lead with their hearts, to continue working together for a better world, and to leave a legacy that would outlive their own lives that night as they danced. Beneath the stars. Do you think Evelyn did the right thing by forgiving Richard? On a scale of 0 to 10, please share your thoughts in the comments. Richard realized how much his life had changed. The man who once pursued success at all costs now realized that true value lay in creating something with purpose and passion alongside the woman he loved. Together, Richard and Evelyn started a new chapter that would inspire and transform for many years to come. If you liked this story, how would you rate it? Please subscribe to our channel so we can see you in the future video.